Off the shores of Lake Erie, the now-shuttered NRG power plant towers above the choppy waters. In 2008, the power plant received tax subsidies from the local Industrial Development Agency. And those tax subsidies for NRG, plus a handful of other projects, means the Dunkirk City School District forgoes an average of $5 million annually. For the past several months, investigative post J. Shoemaker has been taking a deeper look, finding that school districts throughout western New York are forgoing millions of dollars each year due to tax breaks. Without that funding, the pressure has mounted on the budgets of schools and the shoulders of families. For Investigative Post, this is Reporter's Notebook. All right, so you've been reporting on IDAs for a year. This is essentially your beat, economic development. What have you found in that time?
So when I came here and was assigned the beat of covering IDAs, natural thing to do is you start going to IDA meetings, right? So at the monthly IDA meetings, you show up, they have an agenda, they have a couple projects on the agenda, and the board evaluates them, you evaluate them, and you kind of go from there. So really what I was doing was just kind of day by day, piece by piece coverage of IDAs and, picking out a project here, picking out a project there, and kind of peeking under the hood a little bit and asking, is that really a good deal? Is that really the best use of tax breaks?
Right. Well, that's the essential through line of your beat, right? But you're going deal by deal, right?
Yeah. But what I wanted to do was take a more systemic look at the cumulative effect that these tax breaks have. And if there was some more reporting we could do that went beyond just, essentially policing bad deals. So that brings us to February of this year. There's a report that comes out from this group, Good Jobs First. They are a watchdog group based in D.C. And what they found in their report in February is that New York schools across the board are losing $1.8 billion every year from tax breaks. The schools are. And I found that very astounding. This seemed to be the first time that anybody had really put a dollar amount on the impact that tax breaks in New York are having on communities.
Was this one of the first moments where you're like, the questions that you had coming up at each deal, right? Each meeting, was this one of the first times where you got a peek under the hood, as you said, of what the impact is statewide?
Yeah, this was definitely part of that. There was some earlier work that Good Jobs First had done that was similar to this, but this is the first time that there was really a microscope on New York in particular. And so this was, their report was based off of these financial disclosures. And this is getting, kind of wonky, kind of in the weeds. But essentially, back at the end of 2015, there was a new rule put in place by the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB. And the new rule said that school districts, cities, towns, villages, et cetera, all municipalities, they really ought to, on their annual financial reports, just have a paragraph at the end saying how much revenue they did not collect that year due to tax abatements and other tax breaks. Good Jobs First used some of that data and came up with their figure of $1.8 billion that New York schools were losing every single year. And, I looked at that and said, wow, that's pretty significant. I wonder if we can go deeper on that. So kind of using their report as a jumping off pad, we turned our focus to a handful of districts in Western New York, particularly Dunkirk City Schools, Niagara-Wheatfield Central School District, Warsaw Central, and Letchworth Central. Those are over in Wyoming County. And taking a look at multiple years of their financial reports to get a better understanding of just how specifically these districts were being impacted. And we picked those districts because, at least according to Good Jobs First research, they were among the hardest hit. And so we compiled some additional information on those districts and, began talking to people, began doing interviews. And what we found is that those districts were, in fact, losing out a lot. And it wasn't just, a one-year blip. This wasn't just a one-off that we found. This was every single year they were losing millions of dollars.
Really? So it's not necessarily lost revenue. As you had said, people come down on either side. But was your reporting able to discern that these school corporations are foregoing this revenue? I mean, is there a real effect on the activities that students might have, the financial burden on families? Is there a real impact?
There is. There is a real impact. And the real impact that we were able to locate is not that these schools are failing necessarily, but that these schools could have more resources. These schools could be a little bit better, and they're not because they don't have that extra money. I'm glad you mentioned the lost revenue piece, because this is kind of a thread that we need to pull very gently. So one of the things we also found in the reporting is that there are very credible academic studies that show anywhere between 75% and 90% of jobs that were created with the assistance of a tax break would have been created anyway.
Really?
So what that means, because IDAs and the tax breaks that they grant, they ostensibly are meant to create jobs. And so if those jobs would have been created, the vast majority of them, if they would have been created anyway without those tax breaks, then it's not a stretch to conclude that the tax break was not necessary.
Total annual cost to schools in our 5-county region in Western New York tends to be between about $25-27 million per year that schools are losing out on. Would these developments have occurred without those agreements? Maybe, right? So that's a lot of money that could have gone into our school system, and we're not talking about pocket change here.
That was Russell Weaver, Director of Research at Cornell University's Industrial and Labor Relations Buffalo CoLab. So you could have a situation in which schools are collecting full taxes on those projects and getting that amount of new revenue. IDAs will argue that this tax revenue is not, in fact, lost revenue. And through our reporting, what we found is that there's a lot of reason to question that. It does seem plausible, if not probable, that many of the jobs that have been created in these areas and, extrapolating into Western New York would have been created anyway without these tax breaks. And what that means is that everybody could have been paying slightly less taxes because the way the tax burden works, it gets spread out over the population. And it could have meant that the schools have more revenue every year. And we're talking millions of dollars every year. I previously sat down with Elizabeth Marcello. She's a senior research analyst with reInvent Albany. Are IDAs, in fact, harming schools in New York?
Yes, they're harming schools, and I would say they're harming more than schools. They're harming existing businesses who aren't going to get tax breaks. They're harming tons of other local governments whose taxes are being abated by IDAs. And they harm the economy, I think, in general. They don't grow economies, they harm them.
But I found a couple parents to talk to about this. And this one woman from Dunkirk, her kids go to Dunkirk City schools. She kind of put the reality of the schools to me this way.
For example, like as a parent, for every single thing the kids do, there has to be a fundraiser. So there's just constant fundraising on the shoulders of students and families.
Yeah.
So it's just exhausting. So obviously, as an economically depressed area, Dunkirk in particular, putting so much of it on the shoulders of the families is really difficult. So to know that tax credits additionally are pulling even more money out of the district is disappointing.
Yeah.
That's a soft word.
The point here is that the district could have millions more in their revenue, in their budget, if it weren't for these tax breaks. And, It's not too big of a stretch to say the district might be using some of that money to pay for uniforms, to pay for field trips, to pay for this, that, the other thing. So there is a material impact on parents, kids, and families, when these tax abatements are pulling that amount of revenue.
Mm-hmm. So what exactly are IDAs? I mean, how do they work in tandem with the community, and what are the history of them? How did we get to this point in time in regards to school districts here in Western New York?
So first of all, what are IDAs? IDAs are industrial development agencies, and they are these public agencies technically overseen by the state, although they were, at the time that we were still creating new IDAs, they were created by county government or town government for that matter. But they're technically wards of the state. So they're kind of in this strange middle ground between local government and state government. And what they are empowered to do is they have a board. The board is appointed by local politicians. Erie County, for example, the legislature, the county executive, other, public officials. They're the ones who appoint the board members. And these board members are tasked with reviewing proposals that come from private industry, individual companies, seeking tax breaks for particular projects that they want to do. So that's what IDAs do. But where did they come from? That's where things get a little tricky. And this is where we have to wind back the clock. And we're going basically back to World War II. So after the war, all the soldiers are coming home. The industrial base is roaring back to life. A lot of that was concentrated in the North and the Northeast. I mean, there's a reason why it's called Bethlehem Steel, right? Founded in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world. You come over here to Western New York, you have a number of steel towns, including Dunkirk, including Buffalo. And essentially what happens is the South, the southern states, they say, we want in on that action. In other states, around the country, they said, we want a piece of that. So they created this new product called an industrial revenue bond. Now, what is an industrial revenue bond? An industrial revenue bond is a bond, which is a form of debt, that is issued by the government, but the government does not use the money. The money instead goes to a private company. So these were used in other states that didn't have as big of an industrial base as the Northeast did, were used to build an industrial base. The government loans money in the form of a bond. The money goes to an industry, a company, and they begin, to build their factory to do what they're going to do. Now, this was new at the time because if you think about it, like a bond, bonds had existed for a while.
Sure, yeah.
And bonds are typically public affair, government affair, meaning that the government sells a bond, they issue debt, and then they use the money to build something for the public good. That could be a hospital, that could be a school, that could be a road, an airport, a train line, that kind of thing. But this was the new way of doing economic development in the post-war years. New York is late to this game. We don't do industrial revenue bonds or things of that nature until the late 60s. We're like the 40th or the 45th state or something.
Really?
We're pretty late to hop on this train, in part because we already had an industrial base here.
Things were already going for us, right? Yeah.
But because all these other states hopped on early and they started doing these industrial revenue bonds to build their industrial bases, some of the companies in Western New York and other parts of the Northeast, they began leaving. And in 1969, the state legislature basically says if your community wants an IDA, an industrial development agency, that has the power to issue these industrial revenue bonds, you can do that. And so that leaves us in this position where these communities now have these like quasi-state agencies that are able to issue tax abatements, issue these bonds as a way of maintaining an industrial base. So that's kind of their stated purpose, is that we're going to give this money, to the private sector, to the captains of industry, the Bethlehem Steels of the world, and in other related companies, so that they will maintain and stay put essentially here, and that we are going to reap the benefits of that. Now, on paper, that might make sense, but this is also just preceding deindustrialization. It was only about a decade after New York adopts IDAs that industrial employment in the United States peaks and then falls. This is what Erie County Executive Mark Polenkars told me when I sat down with him.
And the impact of Bethlehem Steel leaving was astronomical. Unless you were alive, you do not know how negative it was. It created a spin-off effect, and a lot of businesses that still exist in the world that were originated here moved. We're getting out of this area. It's time to get out, go somewhere else. Most of them moved down south.
In that kind of landscape, IDA tax breaks almost have an opposite effect, meaning that rather than, use the public's money to retain jobs, to retain this industrial base, you're really just having this money flow into the hands of, capital, as it were, people who have, heads of companies, people who are able to access large amounts of capital. And you're not really incentivizing them to do things that they necessarily wouldn't have done anyways. So as a result, you have a slow hollowing out of the tax base, kind of bit by bit by bit by bit. And you have companies who are responding to market conditions and essentially doing, like some of these studies have found, basically doing what they would have done anyway.
So the majority of deals are windfalls. The system has evolved, allows companies to get paid to do what they would have done anyway. In this case, if they would have stayed anyway, and it sounds like they would have, they still got paid to do what they wanted to do.
That was Greg Leroy. He's the executive director of Good Jobs First.
When deindustrialization started in places like Buffalo, and IDAs were kind of presented as a solution to bring jobs back, did it actually work?
Well, the answer is no, because at least throughout the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, unemployment was going up, and GDP was also going up. Generally speaking, IDAs are a bad bet, according to the reporting that we've done. What I mean by that is you have these agencies that are empowered to give away property taxes, sales tax, mortgage tax, revenue that is used for very important things. Mortgage tax, for example, part of that is used for NFTA buses and trains. Property taxes, that's used for the schools. Sales tax, that's used for other government functions at the state and local level. And what are we getting in return for that money? IDAs will say, well, we've got X number of new jobs. Other economists say you would have had those jobs anyway. Once you have this system of, industrial revenue bonds, once you have this system of, very mobile capital, meaning that, a particular industry, a particular company, they're not tied down to a specific place anymore. Capital is now mobile. We have global financial capital. A piece of that, however, is not only competition between nations for that capital, because, taxes, you get to benefit from that, but competition between states. So you have Buffalo, New York, Erie County, New York, Western New York, competing for an industrial base that India is competing for, that China is competing for, that South Carolina and North Carolina and Texas are competing for, that Georgia's competing for.
It would be great if there was a federal solution, but there's not. And until there is, and I don't think there ever is going to be, local governments are forced to basically compete against each other. As I said, years ago, the thought was, we're competing against Rochester, we're competing against Cleveland. No, not anymore. We're competing globally, but we do have competition with regards to other locations in the United States.
So IDAs, at least as the economic development officials and the politicians put it, are this key piece. That's our bargaining chip to say, your company needs to come here.
So do those politicians think this is the only play they have?
Short answer, yes. Tax revenue is a resource. It is arguably one of the most powerful resources that politicians have. They have the power to create a budget every year. That budget is funded by taxes. The government has the ability to levy taxes, okay? That is a huge, huge amount of power, right? And then to just say, you don't have to pay your taxes. That might certainly, give that individual politician more power, but does it give your community power? No, because now you have less money to spend on the things your people want and need. But we're talking about a cumulative effect here. We're talking about, dozens of tax breaks by dozens of IDAs over years and years and years and years. And this again goes back to the, is this lost revenue or is this not lost revenue? Again, our reporting found good evidence to suggest that this should in fact be counted as lost revenue, because a majority of the jobs created with those abatements would have been created anyway. And so if that is true, if those studies are to be believed, then this counts as lost revenue. And that means that these tax breaks are bit by bit by bit taking available revenue from schools in particular, but also other programs. We mentioned the buses. And who is benefiting from that? Are the kids benefiting from that? Are the parents benefiting from that? Or is it the corporations that are benefiting from